Hi. If climate change changes everything, then all systems have to change. Climate change is a risk in plain sight. It's a grey rhino. It's charging at us down the pathway. And the question is, do we recognise it and will we get out of the way? Our response to the global pandemic would suggest that we're not very good at getting out of the way of grey rhinos. The pandemic, after all, was foretold by scientists and by the international governance community around global health. So can we get out of the way this time? We're talking about systems change from energy systems to food systems to transport systems and financial systems. Let's remind ourselves what's really the goal. The goal is that we should halt warming, therefore cut emissions and remove carbon dioxide and other pollutants from the atmosphere so that we can arrive at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels of warming and no more. It's 1.5 to stay alive. But at the same time, we have to adapt to the already experienced impacts of climate change, and we have to build resilience to that which is still to come, which we have already baked into the planet's chemistry. The science has been a drip, drip, drip of unequivocal evidence to back this up, resulting in the latest assessment report in August of this year. But it isn't just the science. The first economic report that would imply that climate change posed serious risks and that we would be better off if we paid for the costs of action rather than paid for the costs of inaction came out 15 years ago, the Stern report commissioned by the UK government. Since then, the World Bank, with World Development Reports and other private initiatives, including the New Climate Economy, have consistently updated that information and agreed with that analysis. And on the back of that economic analysis, that the costs of climate change will be felt across all economies everywhere and disproportionately by the lowest income and the poorest within those economies, has been the realisation that this poses a significant risk to our financial systems. In 2015, just before governments arrived in Paris to negotiate the Paris Agreement, Mark Carney, the then Governor of the Bank of England, gave a seminal speech to Lloyd's of London where he talked about the fact that we needed to break the tragedy of the horizon being short-term in terms of business, short-term in terms of politics, and short-term in terms of financial cycles. Since then, the organisations that manage the global economy and regulators of the financial system have increasingly understood climate to be a risk. And so we have huge implications for today's policymakers. There is an urgency about the way in which we react to this climate emergency. It requires systems change, multiple systems change, all at the same time. It requires a level of international cooperation, which often eludes us, and the price of inaction. The price of inaction is higher than the price of action. Last year, the World Bank looked at the way in which financial risks transmit to macrofinancial conditions and back again. And we can see that we're dealing with both the physical risks of climate change and the transitional risks. So this is the risk that is inherent in any transition from one way of being to another. The physical risks actually have a huge impact on growth and uncertainty. We see that in the impacts on GDP across the states of the United States as a result of extreme weather events. And that breeds instability. It isn't just the World Bank, and despite 4 years of hiatus, while the Trump administration pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement and then we went back in again this year, the Federal Reserve of the United States also understands the relationship between risk from climate to economic activity and to financial risk. So the climate risks that come from the impacts we're already experiencing do actually change the way in which we think about assets. There is a reason why trillions of dollars are divesting from coal in particular, but now increasingly from other fossil fuels. This is not a long-term part of the solution. And we see that economic instability can come from climate risks as well, and the interplay between economic instability and financial risk. The watchword this year has been to build back better. Could we use the opportunity of having to recover from a global pandemic, which has pushed countries into liquidity crisis and debt crisis, which has wiped growth off the books of the most advanced economies? Could we use the build back better to build back better more inclusively and with a greener trajectory going forward? Despite the rhetoric and the recommendation of most economic actors that this is the way to go, we still see that within the richest countries, the rhetoric is not matched by reality. And for those who are tracking the greenness of the stimulus that has been agreed in different economic blocks around the world, we can see that we are missing opportunities to grow back greener. In work done by the International Monetary Fund and the International Energy Agency, just thinking about how to use the energy transition in a moment of stimulus, we can see that there are very obvious sort of low-hanging fruits which will be job-rich, which would stimulate local economies, which would help us get back on track after such a dislocation as the pandemic has provided us. And in this chart, which admittedly is difficult to read, we can see that building efficiency and retrofitting the built environment is one of the ways where we can stimulate the most jobs, bring more investment into local communities, and put ourselves on a trajectory for 1.5 degrees of warming. Again and again, we've seen over the last 18 months, economic advisors from the OECD to the International Monetary Fund to national research institutes and academics across the globe basically suggest that there are clear policy priorities that would help us achieve our objectives of getting onto a lower carbon trajectory, a 1.5 degrees compliant trajectory, but also would stimulate our recovery, providing good quality jobs, good quality livelihoods, cleaner air in communities around the world. The need for shovel-ready jobs in those communities most dislocated is very clearly correlated to investment in energy infrastructure, into transport infrastructure. We see new projects that could be stimulated in the same way. And of course, then there are the policy measures which would mean that the growth trajectory that comes out of this would be lighter on the planet as well. And these are suggestions around carbon taxes or carbon pricing, but also around trade and other parts of the economy. But when we talk about financing climate change, what are we talking about? A lot of this would seem to be just normal economic stimulus. Well, we're talking about the cost of mitigation. That is the cost of reducing emissions and removing emissions from the atmosphere. That can include everything from putting prices on pollution, incentivizing energy efficiency, stimulating more investment, faster investment into clean energy, decommissioning polluting energy generation now so that it happens sooner than it might do otherwise, incentivizing transitions in land management, halting deforestation, carbon capture, storage and use, and new technologies to capture emissions and to remove them from the atmosphere. We're also talking about the costs of adaptation, which of course receives often much less attention, but is absolutely fundamental, and is absolutely fundamental for those who are less well off within society. This is the cost upfront of building our environment and infrastructure to withstand the impacts of climate change that are coming, to invest in the adaptability of our farming and our land use. But it's also the additional healthcare costs and the relocation of communities and other things which are happening as a result of climate change. But we're also now in the era of loss and damage. Loss and damage within climate negotiations is the term that is used to describe the effects or the costs that are being borne by those who did nothing to cause the situation that we find ourselves in today, but who are paying the price. And this is often small island developing states, coastal communities, vulnerable communities within vulnerable countries. So we have to find ways to finance transitions which help us move to a greener trajectory, one which is more resilient, and one where we have already incurred and will incur incredible costs for the most vulnerable within society. We can track the flows of finance from the developed world to the developing world, public and private, which are supposed to be part of the grand bargain in climate negotiations, that we will not leave anyone behind as we make these transitions. And we can see that there are significant flows of domestic resources within developed countries, from developed countries to developing countries, and that there are significant resources from outside the developed world within developing countries being deployed against climate goals. And these kinds of charts are now used to track all of the different sources of climate finance, the transition mechanisms or the transfer mechanisms of that climate finance, and where that climate finance goes. But the headline here really is that bold promises made by the developed world over the last 10 years or more, that we would help developing countries pay for the costs of transition to green growth, to pay for the adaptation and resilience costs that they are incurring, and to pay for loss and damage, are not yet fully met. And this unfulfilled promise is one of the corrosive aspects of climate negotiations, undermining the kinds of global trust we need in order to make the world a better place. I think it's also important, as I've said already, that we understand that the cost of inaction is higher than action. The insurance costs alone in the United States are rising steeply. The insurance costs of extreme weather events in 2020 were double that of 2019, rising to $95 billion. And this year, as we look at the extraordinary heat dome in the northwest of the United States, the extraordinary fires, floods and hurricanes, we can see that that number's clearly going to be higher again. We now have reasonable estimates of the healthcare costs as a result of climate impacts, from high heat to poor air quality. $820 billion, that's bigger than the defence budget of this country. And we can also see that the solidarity is not quite there yet. The transfer of adaptation-related finance to African countries averages just $5 per African. That's well below the estimated needs. But there's extraordinary waste within our financial system. We still spend $500 billion of farm subsidies every year on food that's neither healthy for us nor sustainably produced for the planet. We still, after many years of agreeing that we would phase them out, have $500 billion of fossil fuel subsidies within the system, subsidising that which we know to be dangerous to ourselves and to the planet. And we are starting to see an extraordinary shift in investment priorities, with over $14 trillion divested from fossil fuels over the last few years from more than 1,300 institutions. And these are pension funds, these are sovereign funds, as well as institutional endowments. So asset owners, asset managers, banks are all in alliances now supporting this transfer of resources from that which is harmful to that which we need more of. Climate finance then becomes absolutely critical in the political negotiations around how we will negotiate packages of greater ambition amongst countries and in each country themselves. At the very core of the climate negotiations upcoming in Glasgow, COP26, we will seek agreement on whether or not the world has met its promise of $100 billion a year by 2020, which will have to increase going forward. We will see whether there will be other additional development finance commitments. And we will also argue over who counts whether there's $100 billion and what counts in that. You'll see new private investment flows being announced. You'll see lots of excitement about commitments to net zero by companies and participation in voluntary carbon markets. And you'll also see domestic capital being mobilised even by the poorest countries as they bring forward new green banks and new green development funds. But we're not yet fully mainstreaming the need for the global economy and the global financial system to recognise the crisis we're in. Microsoft and others have talked about the need to help them meet their extraordinary, ambitious agreements around net zero. They need to be able to participate in voluntary carbon markets. The voluntary carbon market is the idea that one could buy a credit from an entity or a country that has excess carbon in order to smooth your own transition towards a net zero goal. Of course, voluntary carbon markets have existed for a long time, but they offer a potential now as we are in a race to net zero. But they will have to be well administered, they will have to have integrity, and they will have to be transparent. What that means is that when a company makes a claim that it is on a pathway to net zero, it needs to show how it scientifically arrives at that claim. It will need to then be transparent about the trade that it's making or the credit that it is buying, and that credit is actually a good credit. All of this architecture, these new ways of being within the international financial markets, within the international global economy, are hybrid arrangements where the private sector and government are working together to find a new way of spurring our action forward. We're in a new era where we are building a new financial architecture for climate. And so there is real hope and possibility. If we stop subsidising that which we want less of, if we put a price on pollution, if we incentivise faster transitions, if we support the vulnerable and embed climate impacts into the kinds of social safety nets that every country needs to have, if we boost research and development into the new technologies which will speed our transitions, and if we put money away for loss and damage and understand that we will have to pay those costs, so it is possible for us to see a pathway forward. But for that to happen, climate finance can no longer be a boutique ideal. Climate finance has to actually become mainstream finance, or the mainstream financial sector has to fully internalise the risks but also the opportunities that come with growing green. For the last 70 years or more, international economic governance has been instituted in the Bretton Woods institutions, whose role it was to be the banker of last resort and to be there for reconstruction and development. Today, in a world where climate is everything, their mandates have to change. There is no form of development that takes place outside of the context of climate change. There is no macroeconomic stability or macroprudential risk management outside of the context of climate change. And so, as more resources are put into these international institutions to help countries manage their way out of the pandemic crisis, so those resources will have to be used to make sure that recovery is green and inclusive. And as China becomes the largest investor in infrastructure around the world, and China commits to make sure that that investment is green, so the West needs to step up as well. And we need to have a much greater investment in the infrastructure needs of developing countries, because one of the things we've learnt from the pandemic is that none of us are safe until everyone is safe. And despite the fact that we're at a great power rivalry between the United States and China, is it possible to imagine that we work together to help developing countries get onto a pathway of sustainability? All of this poses huge research questions. Big data can identify risks now. We use big data to understand who's at risk from sea level rise. But how accessible is some of that data for decision making in developing countries when it's held in private hands? How do we find new forms of governance around the great advances that big data can provide us? If climate poses a macroprudential risk, then why do we always talk of the green premium or the cost of climate action? Why don't we talk about the brown penalty or the cost of continuing business as usual? Why is R&D spending still relatively low at such a moment of transition and risk? And what is the public-private partnership that can take that to even the next level? And how can the private and public sectors help each other go further, faster together? Private sector often asks for regulation or a lack of regulation when it wants to pursue a path forward quickly. But we need regulation in order to make sure that the benefits of new technologies can be deployed quickly everywhere for everybody's benefit. And does Does science, does technology have the politics it deserves at this particular moment in time? Thank you.